friends, Mrs. Matway here to try my second take on this wonderful video on how to take notes. Hopefully the sound works a little bit better and you'll have a better idea of what exactly you're supposed to be doing. So before you start taking notes, in order to support your thesis and your arguments, you need to make sure you have a few materials. The first thing you need is the text that you are reading. Remember, you want to only read information at this point that relates to your thesis and your arguments. So you may be reading an article from a database, you may be reading something you printed from the ebooks or something you photocopied from a book you got from the library, or maybe it's a printout from some information provided on the internet. Whatever your text is, make sure you have a nice clean printed copy of it so that you can put pretty colors all over it. The next thing you're going to need is this wonderful, fancy, fantastic chart, which has your thesis statement on it and your 2 to 3 arguments. The last thing that you're going to need, which is the most important, is 3 different colored highlighters or markers or pencils or pens. They have to be 3 colors, and I strongly suggest that you use the same 3 colors the entire time you are taking notes. The first thing you're going to do is number the source that you're reading. So the first article you read, you're going to put a big number 1 at the top. The second source that you read, you're going to put a number 2 at the top, and so on and so forth. This is to help you organize your information. Let's say you have a note that 2 weeks from now you don't understand what it means. If it has a number 1 on the note card, then you can go back to source 1 and perhaps reread and figure out what exactly you were trying to say. So step 1 is to put a number on the source that you're reading. Step 2 is to take your highlighters and assign a color to each of your arguments. So some of you might only use 2 colors because you only have 2 arguments, and some of you might use 3. So as you're reading, when you find information that supports your first argument, or when I find information that supports my first argument, I'm going to highlight that piece of information in blue. So anytime I find a piece of information in an article, in a source, that is about my first argument, I'm going to highlight it in blue. Anything that I find that supports my second argument, I'm going to highlight in green. And anything I find that supports my third argument, which some of you have and some of you don't have, and that's okay, I'm going to highlight in pink. So now that you have your article and it's numbered, and you have clearly identified which color highlighter goes with which argument, now is the time to pause the video and actually read. Now you may find as you're reading this article or whatever your text is that you're using a lot of the same color. That's okay. Don't worry about that. If your first article, all you're finding is stuff to support your first argument, maybe for your second article you should find an article that might support your second argument a little bit better. You may not find a source that talks about all 3 points, and that is okay. So press pause on the video, go read your source, highlight anything that you think will help support any of your arguments, and then when you're done, come back and hit play to see the rest of the video. So I went through and I read my article, and I highlighted my article based on pieces of evidence that I thought supported one of my arguments. So now I'm going to go over to Google Classrooms and open up my digital note cards. So go do that right now. So these are your digital note cards, as you can see right here. The first one is an explanation note card, just to kind of give you guys a better idea of what you should be doing in each of the boxes. The second one here is a sample that I did based on a fact I read in a source. And then the rest of them here are just blank cards for you to really fill out. So if you run out of cards, and all you have to do is just copy and paste a blank one in, and then you can have as many cards as you need. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what is going on this card. It looks a little bit complicated. There's a lot of different boxes and different information that you should be writing in these boxes. I don't expect you to be perfect at it the first time, but the more practice you get with it, the easier it'll become. Really, the goal in this note card is to not only allow you to take notes, but for your notes to be organized and to really help you in the next process, the next step in the process, which is, if it's writing or creating a final copy of something. So let's talk about these boxes. Let's start with this big blue one in the middle. This box is probably the most important because it's going to be the one where you fill in the information from the article. So usually when you were in 6th grade, we had you write one fact per card. Now, because you're moving up in grades, we feel that you can write probably multiple notes per card, but the notes have to be related. So I'm not going to make a bulletin notes about cheese and then also one about weddings. Those two ideas don't go together. But if I have 2 notes that are about a specific ceremony in a wedding, I can include them on one card. All right, I'm not going to be writing full sentences. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be pulling out keywords from the original source that are important. The words that help me understand this piece of evidence. Similar to what you did on the paraphrasing activity worksheet. So you write down your bulleted notes. You might have 3, you might have 4, you might have 5, whatever it may be. Remember, don't write full sentences, just pull out keywords. All right, so you're gonna do that first. Once you've done that, you're gonna say to yourself, okay, I highlighted this in what color? That color connects to which argument. You always want to have a piece of evidence connect back to an argument. So let's say this piece of evidence best supports my argument on arranged marriages. I'm just going to type in here arranged marriages. Okay, so whatever argument your evidence supports, you're going to write a little bit about that argument right there. You're going to just write arranged marriages, or Ganges River, or dowries, whatever your arguments are about, the one that it best supports. The next thing you're going to do is just identify the number of the source that it came from. We wrote the number at the top of our source for a reason. It's to add it to our note card. So if this note came from my first source, I need to write that down, because if in 2 weeks you're reading this and you're like, this doesn't make any sense to me, this note doesn't work, my paraphrasing doesn't make sense, at least you know what source it came from, so you can go back to that source and see if you can find the information again. So, bulleted notes first, assign or say which argument it best supports, and then identify the number of the source that it came from. After you're done with all that, then you can go back down here and work on this paraphrasing. That's why we did that paraphrasing activity first. It's because now that we've had some practice, we want to take our bulletin notes and paraphrase it in our own words right in this red box here. Try to avoid looking at the original text as you're doing this, so don't just be looking at the words that you have up here. Because if you look at the original text, sometimes you're like, oh, I feel like I have to say it in that way. Another good suggestion is start with a different word than the original text started with. We talked a lot about this when you guys were meeting in small groups about paraphrasing. Sometimes that helps with you changing the language a little bit if you start with a different word than how they started with in the article. So here's where you're going to paraphrase or put the information into your own words that you bulleted up here. Now the last box is where you need to think about all that stuff you've been doing with argument writing in English class and kind of tying back into that murder mystery that we worked on together. It's all well and good. It's great that your piece of evidence fits with an argument, but the big question is, does it go back to my thesis? All right, so in this box right here, you have to come up with that logical rule or warrant that really ties this piece of evidence back to that thesis. How does this piece of information prove that or explain that women are treated unfairly? How does this piece of information prove that or explain how there's no love in marriages? How does this piece of information explain that both people are to blame in this disagreement? All right, so always think back to that. When people say mean words to each other, usually it's because they don't like one another. That was a really poor example, but always go back to what you've been talking about in English about argument writing and what we worked on with that murder mystery. If you cannot think of the logical rule or warrant, it's probably a huge sign to you that this information that you wrote down as these bulleted notes, this piece of evidence, probably does not work for your research, for your exploration. So if that's the case, if you can't think of this, you probably want to get rid of this note. All right, if you cannot think of the logical rule or warrant, this is so important. This is huge because this is helping you understand how this piece of information not only supports your argument, but ties back to your thesis. Really, really, really essential. So, with all that said, bulleted notes go in the blue box here. From the source, the important words from the sentence or sentences you highlighted in the source. Identify which argument this bulleted information best supports in the purple box. Identify the source number that it came from, and that should be on the top of your source. You then take these bulleted notes and you paraphrase them in your own words in this red box. And then last but not least is you take all this information and you write this logical rule or warrant that should explain how it all connects back to your thesis statement. How does it help explain your thesis statement? So you've read your article, you should have already, and you highlighted information. Try going through and filling out some of these note cards. Maybe do about 5 and then say, hey, Miss Snoway, can you check these out for me? And then I can give you some feedback and you can kind of move forward from that point on. So like I said before, this looks like a lot. It's to help you really be organized. If you need help, do not hesitate to ask. That's what I'm here to help. And good luck.